Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Jim Conlan and welcome to the latest episode of our sports show. As you know, we've been previewing and airing all this week and all for the past month or so about our upcoming documentary. We're here based in the heartland of Munster Rugby. Obviously, this is a documentary for all our Irish rugby fans, especially those Munster Rugby fans in particular as well that tune in our way. Our documentary is Global Rugby Legends, My Life in Rugby. And we've spoken to prominent players from all this Northern Hemisphere countries and the Southern Hemisphere countries, so Ireland, England, France, Wales, Italy, and in the Southern Hemisphere, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Argentina. And our guest for this episode, I'm delighted to say, what can I say about this person that's standing here before me? Won multiple World Cups, one of the first players in history to do so. An Australian legend, probably regarded as one of the best number 8s and locks in all time in rugby as well. One of the things you might know about this guy, for his Australian career for a lock, he scored 173 points, 34 penalties, 2 tries, 31 conversions, and once he finished, he was the 12th all-time scoring list for Australia as well. He's captained his country on more or less than 60 times, 55 those as test captains, and all in all, between 1991 and 2001, he's made 86 appearances for Australia, scoring 173 points. He also had a established career for Queensland as well between 96 and 01, 42 appearances, 402 points as well. The one and only John Eales. John, absolute pleasure, sir, to you. And when you hear your name in terms of that, one of the best players in Australian rugby history, one of the only guys to have won multiple World Cups, and to think about that, growing up, you could have been very much a different star if all had gone to pass in terms of a cricket career. It could be we could be easily speaking to John Eales, the cricketer, not John Eales, the rugby player.
Jim, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be on here. Look, I loved cricket growing up, and it was a lot of fun. But rugby, and I was probably more cricket at school and even immediately after school than I was rugby. But then there was something about rugby, and for me, my love for it grew when I got down to Brothers Rugby Club, and I had some great friends down there. And it didn't matter who you were, whether you were the seasoned international or whether you were the young guy coming up through Colts. Everyone belonged down at the club. And it was just a place I loved being. I loved the work ethic of people down there. The people were playing to be excellent, and people were also playing to have fun. And just that combination where you could really marry those two pursuits really attracted me. And I was very fortunate to have Brothers Rugby Club in my life.
And John, growing up in the Eales house, growing up as a youngster in the late 70s, maybe early sort of 80s and sort of such, in terms of what was the family sort of background? Was the family delved in sport? Had you brothers and sisters who were prominent in other sports? Was basketball played? Was footy, as they call it, Australian rules played? Was a bit of soccer? Was there a bit of everything going on in the Eales house? And growing up, were you the most talented sports person in your own family as a teenager?
Yeah, look, I was definitely, I was one of 6 children. I had 4 sisters and a brother, and I was the only one who really had the sports bug. Like, the others were great supporters and were great supporters of me. They all participated in different sports, but I was the only one who really just buried myself into it. Yeah, it was just one of those things. It really just caught my attention, and but I had wonderful support from my family, and that was just a constant. Dad was a coach. He was a school teacher, so he was typically the coach of my first cricket team, my first rugby team. So I think it was his instinct to take me down and then support me, and he was very unconditional in his support. And I think you can't overemphasize how important that is. Like, there was no pressure to win. It was just a pressure to be your best and to enjoy it as well. The last thing he used to say to me all the time before playing was, "John, just remember it's only a game. Go out there and enjoy yourself."
And John, in terms of that, obviously starting off in Queensland as well, but academically, you were very bright as well. In terms, you went on to do a double major in psychology. So had you gone? Were you thinking to yourself, right? If this rugby career doesn't sort of plan out to pass, I'm going to be a doctor. I'm going to be a sort of a specialist in terms of an area of sort of medicines. What interests you about psychology and the human psyche, and did it sort of help you later on in terms of being a captain to have that psychology background?
Yeah, look, I definitely had no ambition to be a doctor as such, but Dad was a school teacher and a school principal, so education was really important in our house. And I think, probably the greatest gift in many respects that Dad gave us was he really emphasised the importance of learning how to learn, not what to learn, and the difference was, how do you learn? Like, it starts with curiosity and then the exploration of something, and what are the skills that will enable you to learn and to explore that curiosity you've got. And for me, my curiosity was probably the greatest curiosity was about people and human performance, whether it be in sport or on or off the field, and that just really grew and stayed with me. And look, I just did the basic level psychology, but I did find some of those core ideas, and I did a lot of reading external to my degree, and I found that very, very useful. Like, one of the books I read, look, it had nothing to do with sport, but it was called The Road Less Travelled, and more about love and life and many different things. But it just had some wonderful insight into it and it wasn't necessarily a book that was written with high performance in mind, but it just had some wonderful messages in it. I read it as a 22-year-old when we were on tour of South Africa, the first tour we went there in years, and I read it again as a 50-year-old a couple of years ago, and it was just as powerful, but had different messages for me at each time in my life.
Suppose, John, I'll take you on now to that first appearance for the Wallabies. And obviously, the 80s, we had some great players in World Rugby. We had Philippe Celan, the French sort of jersey. We had some the Williams, and in terms of Wales as well, and the Edwards, Gareth Edwards, and players like that. And for you, growing up in the 80s, when you started late 80s, when you made your debut for Australia, where did you feel Australian rugby was at that time in terms of, obviously it was an amateur sort of sport then back then. Did you feel that maybe that rugby was a pastime, a hobby? Did you feel maybe that it was going to develop into this professional sort of sport? Did you feel it was heading that way even back then?
Look, I suppose early on it would not have gone through my head. Like, rugby was the sport I loved watching. There was a certain magic about watching whether it be a Five Nations game or a Six Nations game now, or watching the Wallabies on tour at the end of the year, and that lit the spark in my mind. And it really wasn't relevant that rugby wasn't a professional sport. But I think I was lucky for numerous reasons in my career, but two particular ways that are relevant to your question. One, I came into a strong Wallabies team in 1991. The team had been through some really tough times and they'd worked their way up. And I got my way into that team. So I didn't have to go through a lot of those hard years, putting them in a position where they had a chance to win the World Cup. I just came there at the end. It was still hard and had to work very hard, and there was no certainties. But that was very fortunate. And look, the second stroke of luck midway through my career was when rugby turned professional, and I was able to do something I loved, and it went from being a hobby and a very serious hobby to a job for a period of time. And looking back, that was a great opportunity to have both those things, to be able to play and explore the life of an amateur rugby player at international level and win a World Cup, and then to turn that in the middle of my career, where between the ages of about 26 and 31 when I retired, that I was able to put a full focus on rugby as a professional pursuit. I always had other interests outside it because that was the way my brain worked, and I felt I needed that. I felt I was better if I could get away from the game in some respects. I was better when I came back into the game, but it's yeah, that was just a stroke of luck. I mean, that it had nothing to do with me. It was just I was born at the right time.
And obviously that 1991 winning Australian Rugby World Cup team, obviously you came into it, obviously, hey presto, we've won a World Cup. You're such a young member of that sort of team as well. Did you feel that going on to the next World Cup was just a case of delivering the sort of same performance? And South Africa coming from nowhere and winning that Rugby World Cup in 1996, did that give you extra motivation in 1999? Did it drive you on to sort of say, listen, this could be our last chance? The Rugby World Cup cycle only comes around a certain time, that there mightn't be another one. And for as a team, then you built up a team in 1996 that you felt that maybe were a young team. By the 1999, they were very much an experienced sort of outfit. In terms of that, do you feel that 1996 World Cup really was the making of the 1999 team?
I think it was a jolt for us. We certainly went to the 95 World Cup with the intention to win it. We thought we had a really good chance. But in hindsight, I think we focused that whole off-season on how we were going to win the World Cup. I think South Africa, we played them in the opening game. They focused that whole off-season on how they were going to beat us in that opening game of the World Cup. We had this broad focus and they had this very narrow, very specific focus. And they were ready for everything that we turned on them in that game. I mean, it wasn't a big loss on the scoreboard, but we were a mile apart in that game because they were so technically expert in the way that they had approached to play the game and the way they took us on. And we never really caught up from there, which was disappointing. We got knocked out just by England in the quarterfinal, but yeah, that was a really tough day. I think I often say one of the toughest days in my whole career was, yeah, walking off the field that day was hard, but being at Perth Airport in transit on the way home after we got knocked out of the quarterfinal, at the same time as there was a plane load of Australian supporters in transit at Perth Airport on the way to watch us in the semi-final, that was pretty grim.
Suppose, John, winning a World Cup in 1991, and obviously that comes about for the first Rugby World Cup sort of victory as well. In terms of going forward then, in terms of 1999, obviously, with the likes of Tim Horan, with the likes of Joe Roffin, Matt Burke in your side, Chris Latham as well, did you feel that you were carrying the sort of the firepower, especially in the backs, in terms of what you had with Kefu in the centre as well? Did you feel that there was the back line, that if you did your job up front, all you had to do was give them a platform and they could deliver the rest?
Yeah, we knew, Jim, that we had a very strong team. That doesn't mean you're going to win. So we went into that tournament knowing that we had this strong team, but it was only as good as our preparation leading into the tournament and between every game in the tournament. And we worked so hard on that. I think when Australian rugby has been the best, and you could actually equate Irish rugby to this at the moment. I think when Australian rugby has been the best, it's been the smartest team in the world. And I think Ireland, in many respects, look to be, if not the smartest, one of the top two smartest teams in the world. Yeah, they're not necessarily the strongest, they're not necessarily the fastest, but they're super fit. They know exactly how they're going to play the game. They can play the game numerous ways. They can choose how they do it at any particular time. And I feel that's where we were in 1999 and 1991. And it was just this confidence in the team, this sense of trust that we had in ourselves as players, the trust that we had in our teammates, and the trust that we had in our purpose. Like, why, what did it mean to play for the Wallabies? And that, we felt that keenly. And then also the trust that we had in our plan. And it's the amalgamation of all those trusts that give you the chance to build the confidence to have a real go.
And John, in terms of rugby greats now, I have to mention two legends that sadly have departed us, that you would have come into tow many, many times. Jos van der Westhuizen from South Africa and Jonah Lomu from New Zealand. And obviously I was speaking to Sterling Marklock, and he told me that he played a game against New Zealand, and basically 3/4 of the crowd was a European game, had came just to see Jonah alone. And in terms of South Africa, in terms of Eustace's ability just to see openings that weren't there, that no one else could sort of see. What was your sort of memories of coming up against Eustace and Jonah?
Yeah, I think there's only very few players in the world that a team has a very strong individual focus on leading into a game. Like maybe a Tim Horan would fit into that category. A whole team would focus, how do we counter Tim Horan at his best? Eustace van der Westhuizen and Jonah Lomu, I would say, were two standouts in that category. Whenever you played against South Africa and New Zealand, you knew it was a different proposition if those two players. Yes, of course, there were many others who were contributing to that, and they couldn't be as good as they were without those contributions of the other players. But you knew that those two players could do something at any stage of the game that would turn the game. And the first I came across Eustace, really where he came to my attention was that opening game of that World Cup in 1995. And I just remember coming off the field saying, there's a pretty special player. And then he showed that throughout his career. And look, it's sad, by a number of years, they both lived half a life, but by achievements, they both lived full lives.
And in terms of John, in terms of standout players, and
yeah.
We'll edit that out. Obviously, family sort of commitments, the family sort of dog wants us to say he's sort of piece. So no doubt, John, that's why we do pre-records. You just never know.
I think it adds a bit to it, Jim. I think it's good. You should leave it in there.
3, 2, 1. John, just backed in on Ireland. You would have came across Ireland so many times throughout your year, and you would have came across Ireland maybe in the not so great years of Irish rugby, but years when Ireland were growing. What sort of Irish player stood out to you? Was Keith Wood? Was he around that sort of time? Would he have been the sort of player that you sort of looked to and admired coming up against in terms of the Irish jersey?
Yeah, I had huge admiration for Keith as a player and as a person. He's a great man. Brian O'Driscoll, of course, another one. But the guy who I think is just unsung a little bit in my position was Neil Francis. He was a very difficult competitor. He was quite athletic and the sort of guy that would just wouldn't allow, and maybe some of the Irish teams of that era were a bit like this. They wouldn't necessarily hit their top mark of any of the teams in the world, but they had this knack of stopping you playing at your best. They were sort of like maybe the kid in the park who'd stick the stick in the spokes of the bike, so the bike couldn't go anymore. Like they had this way of stopping you playing your best, and there was never more so than that quarterfinal against Ireland at Lansdowne Road in 1991, where we all but lost that game. It was just for some Michael Liner brilliant leadership at the end of the game that really got us through. But it could have been Ireland playing New Zealand in the semi-final of that World Cup. I had enormous respect for the Irish players because they were very competitive. But they were decent people as well through it, and I think at the end of the day, that's one of the important judgments you need to make.
And obviously, as Wallaby coming up against the All Blacks is probably one of the highlights each year. But obviously, your record against the All Blacks, you won so many times against the All Blacks, winning 11, losing sort of 9 in terms of your games against the All Blacks. But you delivered in World Cup years where New Zealand couldn't. It's a sort of similar story with Ireland in terms of they sort of delivering years outside of the World Cup as well. What do you think was the factor that you were able to turn it on in tournament rugby when they couldn't?
I think you need an element of luck as far as injuries are concerned, like making sure things go on to go along there. I think it's also this consistent build up, and I think I know what impresses me about the current Irish team and squad, because it's more than just a team, is this build up that we've seen over a long period of time, and we've seen them perform under many different conditions. And not many teams go to New Zealand and win 2 out of 3 test matches, particularly when you've lost the first test. And that was a signal that this team is as good as any other team in the world. And going into a World Cup, I think it's hard if you're going in and you're just trying to peak for that. I think what's important is you build this confidence over 4 years leading into it. And so that when inevitably injuries happen, when the run of play goes against you, you're not going to panic, because you've been through those moments as a team and you believe in yourselves, you believe in the way you play and your patterns. And the thing I love about the Irish is they are probably the best team at the basics of the game at the moment. I think it's being great at those basics of the game that allows them to take the big moments of a game. We saw that against South Africa last week.
And John, finally, from me to you, if you reflect now, and if you looked at John Eales, the rugby player in his pomp in 1991 and 1999 in front of you, across from the mirror, how would you describe him as a player and as a rugby player, and as what rugby turned him out to be, the man that you see looking back at you today in the mirror?
I think I was fortunate to play in the era I played in, because the era suited me. I'm not sure that I would have been perhaps as relatively as good in the current era. It's a more physical era. I wasn't necessarily a particularly physical player. So I think I really struck the right era for me as a player. But there's no doubt that rugby is a special game. Rugby is a complex game. It's a difficult game, and to play it well, you need to be a master of your specific skills, but also you need to be a generalist and be able to do other things. And you need to be able to combine a whole series of different body shapes and sizes and different skill sets into one team. And when you can do that, it's really a beautiful thing. It feels so good, and it feels good because it's hard. And so I think I learnt from rugby that if you work at something, and as hard as it can be, as tough as some of the times are, whether you're injured or you're just not winning, that if you focus on the basics and you get those right, and you involve and make sure people feel like they love being a part of your team. You can be hard on them, but fair, but they want to be a part of your team, then you can achieve some pretty special things. And that's carried through in my life.
John Eales, my life in rugby, Global Rugby Legends, an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Jim.